Hello, I'm Dr. Claire Vallotton, and together with my co-authors, we are very pleased to bring you Working Well with Babies, Comprehensive Competencies for Educators of Infants and Toddlers. This book reflects not only our own work and passion for infant toddlers and the adults who support them, but also the work of many other colleagues who we'll introduce you to in a little while, the Collaborative for Understanding the Pedagogy of Infant Toddler Development. The purpose of Working Well with Babies is to provide a set of comprehensive competencies for the infant toddler workforce, organizing the competencies into 9 domains and describing the supports that educators need to use their competencies in practice and to develop as professionals. In this workshop, you will learn to understand the rationale for specifically supporting infant toddler educators as a unique group, learn the 9 domains of competencies needed by infant toddler educators and how those domains are related to each other, understand how the book Working Well with Babies engages and supports adult learners in their own professional development, and identify the features of Working Well with Babies and the materials that accompany it, designed for leaders such as trainers, coaches, and administrators to support the workforce to do their best work with our youngest learners. So why focus on infant and toddler educators specifically? You probably already have a good clue as to why we do this. First, the first 3 years of development are a distinct developmental period. We know that this is a sensitive period for a lot of aspects of development, especially vulnerable to relationships and open to relationships. So the quality of care and education that infants and toddlers have during these first 3 years really have long-lasting, lifelong effects on their well-being and development. Babies have unique needs. Each of them comes into the world a different human being. They're each unique and each develops so quickly and their needs change continuously. So infant toddler education is one of the most important jobs in our society because of its lifelong impacts, and it's one of the most complex because of the uniqueness of each baby and the many demands and needs that they have, and of course, the constant care that they need, the constant care, attention, interaction. This work is emotionally challenging, it is physically demanding, and it is cognitively complex work. It's one of the most challenging jobs in our society. Because of that, the educators who work with our youngest learners need a comprehensive set of competencies and support from leaders to use reflective relationship-based practices so that they can do their best work to support the well-being and development of infants and toddlers, and of course also support their families. So this work is supported and part of the Collaborative for Understanding the Pedagogy of Infant Toddler Development in response to this great need in the education of infants and toddlers and the great need of the workforce. CUPID, or the Collaborative for Understanding the Pedagogy of Infant Toddler Development, has joined the national effort to professionalize and support the work of infant toddler educators. I'll tell you a little bit more about CUPID in a moment. So what is CUPID? CUPID, as I said, is the Collaborative for Understanding the Pedagogy of Infant Toddler Development. The T is silent. And really, CUPID is a scholarship of teaching and learning effort in higher education. We're a community of practice, working together across institutions, across disciplines, and we are all interested in infants and toddlers in the workforce and their families, of course. So we're more than 60 scholars across more than 40 US institutions of higher ed and professional development. And we have joined together across our institutions and disciplines to learn how to better teach and train and support the infant toddler workforce from our positions in higher education and other types of institutions. Our ultimate goal is to improve practice in the field of infant toddler care and education by improving our own teaching and providing resources and supports for the workforce. You can learn more about us at www.cupidconsortium.org. We're an open organization and we welcome you to join. So let's look at the comprehensive competencies and the 9 domains of competencies. We've organized what is an immense amount of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that an educator of infants and toddlers need into these 9 domains to make them easier to understand, easier to train, In addition to these 9 domains themselves, the domains have relationships to one another. And so what I'll show you now is not just the content of the 9 domains, but also how they relate to each other. So we start with reflective practice. The reason we start with reflective practice is that when an educator uses reflective practices, that helps them build and practice all of the other competencies that they have. And so starting with that practice and then coming back to reflection again and again helps to develop all of the competencies. So the first domain is reflective practice. Then we have a set of 3 domains, which we think of as these sort of foundational skills or the inner circle. They're the kinds of competencies that you could see if you walked into any infant and toddler program, watched an interaction between an educator and the children. And so we start there with building and supporting relationships. And these relationships are, of course, start with the educator-child relationship, but they're not exclusive to that. It also includes educator-family relationships and supporting the child-family relationships, supporting relationships among the children, and setting that relationship foundation with the relationship between the co-educators and that co-education team. Co-educators or teaching team are like the parents in the family, right? The emotional tone of the whole program or classroom is set in that co-educator relationship. And so we focus on that relationship as well as the educator-child and educator-family relationship. And then, of course, supporting children's relationships with their families. All of this is a set of comprehensive competencies around building and supporting relationships. And from there, from that basis of relationships, we go to the competency set of guiding infant and toddler behavior. Guidance to be effective and to be good for children must be relationship-based, based on the foundation of the relationship that an educator has with a child, and reinforcing that relationship in order to support the child's well-being and development. Rather than framing this as behavior management or classroom management, we think of it as guidance of behavior, because it really is intended to support the child's immediate well-being and long-term development. And it is foundational and built upon building and supporting relationships. And that third competency in this foundational set is supporting development and learning. And that's across domains. So even though there might be specific skills and knowledge you need within each domain, there's also a set of competencies that an educator can use and apply to each domain of development, including health, emotion, physical development, cognition, language, and social skills. And that is based on, of course, their relationships with children and utilizing their skills in guiding infant and toddler behavior. So these are the kinds of things that you could see walking into a program. They're also the kinds of things that are typically assessed in program quality. So they're the kinds of like foundational skills that you'd want to see and support in the infant toddler workforce. Next, we go to a set of competencies that it's not always readily visible in a program. Some of them happen sort of outside of the classroom, although and support the work that goes on in the classroom, but they're not that sort of every moment kind of competencies that you'll see. But nonetheless, they're essential in order to practice relationship-based and reflective practices with infants and toddlers. So the first one is partnering with and supporting diverse families. You can't necessarily see this in every moment, but you should be able to see it every day in the interactions that educators have with families. And so here, it's directly built upon those competencies for building and supporting relationships, but this is a deeper dive into what that educator-family relationship looks like, what it takes to really support the families, to support their children, and how to build that partnership with families and then utilize it to best support the work and development of young children. Next, we go to assessing infant toddler behavior and development and their learning environments. Those assessment competencies should be, and practices should be based on the partnership with families and should reinforce partnerships with families. That assessment, especially when it includes the child's environment. For example, if you were assessing the home learning environment, you would absolutely want that to be based on a partnership with families and to reinforce that relationship there too. After assessment, we go to inclusion of infants and toddlers with special support needs. Of course, assessment, screening, and then individualization are absolutely necessary for including infants and toddlers with special support needs, and all that should be based on the partnership with families. And of course, that supports your ability to support development and learning for all children, that individualization and responsiveness, and the competencies you need to respond and be supportive of infants and toddlers with special support needs are some of the same competencies you need for supporting development and learning of all children. So that's really that individualization piece. So now we have this sort of outer loop of the competencies that you won't see in every interaction, but are nonetheless very necessary for high quality work in everyday work. Finally, we go to a set of competencies that are really more about the adult to adult skills. Even though educators do their primary work with infants and toddlers, their skills in working with adults are essential for doing the best work with infants and toddlers and for building themselves as professionals. So we have this sort of outer loop that starts again with relationships, and involves partnering with and supporting diverse families, but also goes to mentoring and leadership. So here is the skills needed for the adult educator working with other adults, including that mentoring and leadership. And we're defining mentoring and leadership not necessarily as a specific role, but as a skill set. You can mentor other teachers. You can mentor families, you can mentor other adults who are developing their own competencies for supporting children's development and learning, or to guide children's behavior effectively. So those mentoring skills and leadership skills can be from many different potential roles, but that is a competency set that if one were to step into coaching or supervision, that would be a special focus for that educator. And finally, we have the competency set of professionalism. As an educator develops all of these competency domains, they are in fact developing their professionalism. As they become more knowledgeable, more aware of their own competencies, their knowledge, dispositions, and skills, they're developing an explicit sense of themselves as a professional, taking their own learning in hand and working to develop themselves in the field. And so as we see those competencies build and progress, so too we see professionalism build and progress, but professionalism has its own set of competencies in addition. So skills for communicating what you do, skills for advocating for the field and for your own work. And those are related to mentorship and leadership skills. So we see the connections between all of these competency domains, just like we would see connections between young children's domains of development. And finally, we see the facilitating conditions. This is not a competency set. It is the conditions, the resources, the leadership, the policies and programs necessary to support an educator to develop all of these competencies and to use them in practice. You can have an excellent set of skills without the ability to practice them because the conditions just aren't right. Same is true for young infants and toddlers. They can have some of the skills, but unless they have opportunities to practice them, unless they have the right conditions, the right materials, the right time, they're not going to be able to practice and build those skills. And the same is true for educators. We have to support them to do their best work with infants and toddlers. And so the facilitating conditions are really about what enables educators to build those competencies and use them in practice to do their best work. Each of those competency domains, those 9 domains of competencies, have within them 3 dimensions. Competencies are made up of knowledge, dispositions, and skills. So here I'll give you an example of those and show you how those link to practices and how they're supported by facilitating conditions. We're going to use an example from the reflective practices domain. So here we have 5 different sort of sets of knowledge that are the foundational knowledge in the competency domain of reflective practice. The first one, for example, is understanding of what reflection, reflective practices, and reflective functioning are. Second is knowledge of models and approaches for engaging in reflective practice. The fourth one, understanding of what influences adults' reactions and responses to children. My favorite is probably the third, understanding that all behavior has meaning and is affected by a host of things such as physiology, relationships, and context. So that's some of the foundational knowledge one would need for reflective practice. But there's also a set of dispositions for reflective practice. Dispositions are things like beliefs, attitudes, things that you couldn't necessarily look up as a fact from the science of child development, but are nonetheless important in the way that we approach the work. So some of the dispositions needed for reflective practice are curiosity about one's own and others' internal lives, openness to others' perspectives, and openness to change. Then we get to skills. Knowledge and dispositions both lead to or in support a skill set. So here there are 8 different skills for reflective practice. For example, the first one is creating an environment that supports your own reflection. Skills to take care of yourself in order to be present in your work. Skills to pause reactions before responding. That's a tough one. That's about your own self-regulation. That's what we're constantly supporting children to do, but we need to be able to do it too, both to model it and to engage in reflective practice. So each of those competencies are domains have in them knowledge, dispositions, and skills. And all of these lead to those reflective relationship-based practices that you can observe on the floor, observe in interactions, and see when educators are doing their sort of behind the scenes work. So those reflective relationship-based practices promoted by the competencies. And so each chapter talks about the sets of competencies, as well as the practices and strategies that are seen when you have those, and describes the facilitating conditions that are necessary in order to build and use these competencies. For example, reflective practice condition number 1 is the space and time to take care of the educator's own physical and personal needs. That is one that we didn't initially think we needed to say, but it turns out we do, because at least 1/3 of infant toddler educators do not get even planned, they can't even count on a planned bathroom break, let alone the time for observation, reflection, and planning, paid time for observation, reflection, and planning. So we felt the need to say, look, we have to start our basic supports of this workforce with the ability to take care of their basic needs. And without that, we cannot expect them to be able to be present in their work, reflecting in their interactions with infants and toddlers. So there's a number of facilitating conditions for each of these competency sets that educators need in place in order to practice those skills in their work with infants and toddlers. So now you know a little bit about the content. The chapters of the book after the first chapter is really about the workforce themselves. Who are they, and why are they so essential for our well-being, really, for infants and toddlers' well-being and for the well-being of society. And then we go through the remaining 9 chapters in the book, goes through each competency domain, presenting each of those skill sets, or the knowledge, dispositions, and skills, and facilitating conditions within them. So now we'd like to walk you through some of the features of working well with babies that are intended to engage adult learners. So we're going to give you some of the highlights from that. One of the first ways that we intentionally engage adult learners is by providing well-organized information. So adult learners need not just to know the smattering of information, there's so much of it, to know about young children, to know about the work, but they don't just need that. They need ways to organize the information. We have to have ways to organize the information, to remember it, to link it together, to link it to what we already know and what we already do. So one of the real concentrations of this book is to present the information in a really well-organized way. And that's sort of like how we organize the competencies and then the information within it. So this is just an example of the well-organized information from the chapter on supporting and partnering with diverse families. We have a table showing how family culture is reflected in daily interactions and routines. And it just breaks down a number of routines throughout the day and interactions, and the ways that we know from the science of child development that families differ from one another in meaningful ways that affect development. And so what an educator might look for to understand a family's culture. Here's another example of well-organized information. This is from the Supporting Development and Learning chapter. In that chapter, we go in depth through the principles of development and learning that we know from the science of child development, and give many different examples of how we know those principles are true from the science. And then to link that to practice, what we've done is take each of those principles that we know from the science and then extrapolate from from there to what we can do based on that principle. So an example is babies are born already developing and learning. They come into the world developing and learning. So in practice, we view babies' behaviors as meaningful. We intentionally support their learning from birth, and we support the development that is already happening, because it is already happening. And that's our best cue as to how to support it. So this is just an example of how we go from the principles to practice and organizing the information in a clear and structured way, making it easier to remember and easier to understand. We also engage adult learners through lots of different visual aids. We use visual aids to show sequences, processes, to show hierarchies of information and the steps to take. Here's an example from the reflective practices chapter, going through a cycle of reflection that educators can use to understand children's behavior at a deeper level and respond more effectively. We start with observation. What is the child doing? And then we give a cue. There's the question that the educator can ask themselves: what is the child doing? Then we give a cue as to what to observe. Observe the context and the child's behaviors to recognize and identify the cues. The next question: what is the child thinking and feeling? And we ask the educator to interpret the child's mental state from their behavior, keeping in mind their cues and context. This starts the reflection process. And what does the child need? Consider the links between the child's mental state, their context, and behavior to identify the underlying need before you respond. Asking yourself, how can I respond? How can I respond to meet the underlying need? Determine how to respond by observing, wondering, and reflecting. What does the child actually need right now? What can I do to meet it? And then after responding, observe again. Have the child's needs been met? Watch how the child responds to your actions to interpret whether the child's needs have been met. So we have this observation cycle. Instead of jumping right from what is the child doing to what do I need to do to respond, really thinking about what the child is experiencing, what they need, and then responding. This is just an example of one of the visual aids that are provided throughout the book. Another example of visual aids are just photos of children, the sort of like visual anecdotes that really give an insight into what's going on. And here we see a child shifting what is intended in one learning experience into a wonderful sensory experience, and an educator responding to that and using it. So visual aids of photos really help engage readers and increase understanding. And of course, everyone loves to see beautiful babies. So we do use photos throughout the book. Another way that we engage adult learners is through providing concrete anecdotes and examples. We have quotes throughout the book from educators. We have real life examples from our observations in classrooms. Here is an example of a learning plan or a planned experience developed by an educator, and what that might look like. So this is just an example from the supporting development and learning chapter. We also provide concrete practices and strategies. So breaking down information in an organized way into strategies that educators can use to do their work and engage in the practices. So this is an example from the guiding behavior and development chapter, explaining the emotional experience from the child's perspective, what the child's underlying needs might be related to that emotion, and then concrete strategies for scaffolding emotion regulation. So when a child feels frustrated, what they need is to feel capable of accomplishing their goal. And what an educator can do is to acknowledge their feelings and then help them find a solution to reach their goal. So that is a strategy. This is just one example of the ways that we provide strategies throughout the book. Here's another example of strategies. In the leadership chapter, we have the competency of helping other adults learn to reflect on their lives, histories, and interactions with children. And after explaining a little bit about what that competency skill is, we go on and provide some strategies for accomplishing it. So in an interaction with another adult, you can ask about their mental states that are behind their own behaviors, ask open-ended questions and use I wonder statements. Listen carefully and follow up with related questions, and use your active listening skills to summarize in your own words what you heard from them so that they feel understood and so that they can clarify if they weren't understood. So those are concrete practices and strategies that an educator can use to implement that skill set of leadership S2. We also engage adult learners in practices to develop their own skills. While the text Working Well with Babies provides a lot of knowledge, the foundational knowledge to work with infants and toddlers and their families, and gives insights into the dispositions that are useful for the work. The only way to develop skills is to actually practice skills, right? And that's something that a book cannot do. But what we've done is to develop the Professional Learner's Guide, which is a workbook. It's a free download and resource to accompany Working Well with Babies. And it was written with partner Gina Cook. And this Professional Learner's Guide walks through in workbook style each chapter of the text and turns it into an active, interactive experience. So by taking the Professional Learner's Guide, an individual educator can promote their own skills, develop their own skills through practicing. So here are some of the things that you'll find in each chapter of the Professional Learner's Guide. We have an assessment section where we ask the reader to self-assess their own knowledge, dispositions, and skills within that domain. That gives them a starting place. Well, what do I already have well established in terms of competencies, and what should I focus on learning while I go through this chapter? Then it engages them in reflection. In the reflect section, they think about their current dispositions, recent interactions they've had with children and families, and their ongoing practices. So kind of making it concrete. What am I currently doing? And what do I think about that? What does that reveal about my own work and my own thinking and competencies? Next, we give practice suggestions, ideas for ways to change practice or develop skills in working with children and families. So these are things that the educator could do that week or the next week to practice and develop new skills. And finally, we have a develop section that really is forward thinking. It challenges readers to work on developing some of the more difficult competencies, some of the more advanced competencies, and to set their own goals for their professional development within that domain of competencies. So really taking their own professional development in hand, developing themselves as professionals through this practice of skills. We engage adult learners with interactive handouts and learning activities. Here's just a few examples. These are from the Professional Learning Guide, although you will see some also linked directly from the text. And so there's some downloadable handouts that will be linked from the text, take you to a URL and can be downloaded. And then you'll see these interactive activities. So walking a reader through a reflection, for example, each step of a reflective process, or challenges them to come up with an anecdote or to rewrite some of the things that they are used to saying to children. So we get these opportunities to sort of practice and learn in the handouts. We also engage adult learners through reflection. Of course, we started with reflection, and we would be amiss if we didn't use reflection and reflective practices throughout the entire book. So there's each chapter ends with a reflect back, think ahead section that invites the reader to think about what they've learned so far, reflect on their own competencies within that domain, and to think about what they would like to develop next. Where they are challenged in their work and the competencies that they would like to go to next, and then links them to the Professional Learner's Guide to help them develop those skills and competencies. Another example of reflection is in the Professional Learner's Guide itself. You'll see the self-assessment in each of at the beginning of each chapter. This one is an example from the first chapter where it invites the reader to think about the whole set of competencies that they have, and just to do a quick self-assessment of where they think they are in terms of the level of skill they have in that general competency domain, and how important they think that domain of competencies is for their work. And this is really just an opportunity to reflect right at the outset, to think about the goals they might set for their own learning as they work through Working Well with Babies book and Professional Learning Guide. The next thing we want to share with you is resources for mentorship and mentoring and leadership. So we have a number of things we've built into Working Well with Babies and in the Professional Learner's Guide that is this additional information to support leaders and mentors to work with infant and toddler educators, whether you're in higher education, whether you're training in-service workers, or leading a coaching and reflective coaching group. So here's some of the information we provide. First, there's sort of enriched information. Appendix A is designed to support some of the foundational knowledge for supporting development and learning. So it is a robust resource with lots of information about child development from birth to age 3, so that it provides a sequence of development in each domain, including health and safety behaviors, behavior regulation, emotion, sensory motor information, cognition, language, and social skills. So it provides that sequence of development and explains some of the processes going on in development in each of those domains. So for a professional who does not have that foundational knowledge yet, or wants to check their own foundational knowledge, they can go to Appendix A. Appendix B contains red flags and false alarms in behavior and development. So this supports development and learning knowledge competency 4, and it provides what should be seen as alerts. If one were screening development or well-being and behavior, it should be an alert that that child might need more support. And then also false alarms, things that are sometimes seen as a delay in development, but are really indicators of typical development. But so those are the false alarms piece. So this is a tool, it's foundational knowledge of development, but it's also a tool to develop those assessment skills as well, and attune your mind to and your observations to what's going on in development. And so it's a tool for individualization, as well as calling in more supports and resources for children and families who need them. Another resources is key terms. So we have a number of terms throughout the book that we haven't defined necessarily in the text, assuming that perhaps that's a term already known, but we want to provide a robust explanation of what that term is and its relevance to the work, so that educators and readers can make sure they're on the same page, or if you're using this as a training resource, you can make sure that everyone has the same understanding of that term before you go into it. So this is a good, if you're a trainer, it's a good reminder of what those key terms mean, and you can gauge whether you think that you need to go over the meaning of them with the educators that you're training. And then we have resources and further readings. So these provide a deeper understanding for each chapter. So each chapter has some resources. Either they might be a website, they might be some resource to actually do the work, or it might be a research article that would deepen understanding about the work itself, the concepts in the chapter. So those can be used for sort of enhanced development, for pursuing your own curiosity. If you have an interest in a particular topic, they could be used by instructors or trainers to deepen their own knowledge before training on this content, or as an assigned reading in a learning group. And then also as a support for trainers and teachers, we have an instructor's guide. The instructor's guide is embedded in the professional learner's guide, and it really just goes through how to use each of the sections in the professional learner's guide in each of the chapters as assignments, as discussions, reflections, so that the professional learner's guide basically turns into an instructional tool in the hands of a teacher or trainer. So that's intended to support the teaching and training resources. We have handouts and learning activities throughout the book, as well as in the professional learner's guide. So you'll see links throughout the book, little URL links to the handouts, downloadable things, and then learning activities, both in some of the handouts and the professional learner's guide. Here's an example of one from the guiding behavior chapter. It's rewriting the way that we encourage babies' positive behavior. So it goes through a lot of examples of what you might see and hear in a classroom, and what might be a typical response from an educator using praise, wanting to use a positive approach to supporting behavior, and then goes through how we can turn that into an acknowledgement or encouragement instead of praise to be more effective in the ways that we encourage children's positive behavior. So the first example is 3 older toddlers just cleaned up after themselves at the Arts Center. And a typical praise we might say is, good job, everyone, but this isn't very specific. And it's a use of praise which can unintentionally undermine children's motivation. So instead, we can use an authentic acknowledgement or encouragement. An example of acknowledgement would be the 3 of you worked together to pick up the paintbrushes and put them away. Simply stating what the children did, but pointing out specifically what it was that they did. And then encouragement would be, thank you for helping keep our classroom clean. Again, an authentic response from the educator. So this handout goes through a number of different examples that might be typical that an educator might see or hear, and then ask the educator to think about praise, situations in which they've used praise or which they've seen praise used, and then to come up with an alternative, either acknowledgement or encouragement that they could use next time they do that. So this is one of those opportunities to kind of practice on your own that then goes to practice in the classroom. And the last resource that we want to highlight is for leadership and mentoring is a checklist for the facilitating conditions. We mentioned before that those facilitating conditions are necessary for good practice in the classroom, necessary for building the competencies and then using them in practice. And this is a simple checklist, 3 pages, that leaders, administrators can use to think through their programs and whether the degree to which they are providing the necessary resources, whether they have the policies in place to enable the education team to do the best work with children and families. So we've talked through what those reflective practice ones are. In the building and supporting relationships, the facilitating conditions are consistency and staffing and keeping co-education teams together. The second one is low teacher to child ratios and small group sizes. The third is policies to support the continuity of care or looping between classrooms, and then policies to support primary care groupings. So thinking about, do we have the supports in place for the education teams to do their building and supporting relationships, to do their best practices in that work? This list of facilitating conditions, like I said, can be used by leaders, administrators. It can also be used by educators to think, do I have the supports I need? Yes, here's all these wonderful skills I'd love to practice, and I want to do my best work with children and families, but do I have what I need in order to do that? So this could be an advocacy tool. It could also be a tool for grant writing. If you're looking for specific funds to enhance a certain aspect of your program, that's probably going to be in developing some facilitating conditions. For example, bringing in a reflective supervisor consultant. So this kind of thing could be used to look at your program, decide together on priorities, generating a conversation between educators and the leaders in the program, and thinking through what are our priorities together. What do we already have firmly in place? Where do we want to develop as a program next? And then what can we do for resources to get that? So this is really a tool for self-assessment at the program level and for conversations. In each chapter of Working Well with Babies, we explain those facilitating conditions, and we put that really at the beginning of the chapter. So we have a little introduction about what the competency set is, and then we go into the facilitating conditions so that a leader can flip right through to the beginning of each chapter and learn a little bit more about those facilitating conditions and how and why they are necessary for the work in order to build their understanding of the supports that educators need to do this important work. This is what we wanted to share with you today about working well with babies. And next, we would love to hear what are you still curious about? What questions do you have? And we'll be available for a Q&A right after this presentation wraps up. I wanted to say thank you to everyone today for participating in this workshop. We're so excited to share this resource with you and see how it can be used to support infant toddler educators in the amazing and important work that they do. And we invite you to visit redleafpress.org and to use the code WWWB for a discount on working well with babies. We look forward to taking your questions and interacting with you.